In a colonial mansion, converted into a conference center, two men who have spent half a century trying to destroy each other prepare to sign a document that will officially end Latin America's longest running armed conflict. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos adjusts his reading glasses as he reviews the 310-page peace agreement one final time. Across the mahogany table, Rodrigo Londoño, better known by his nom de guerre, Timoshenko, commander of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, does the same. The moment carries a weight that numbers alone can't capture. Santos represents a political establishment that has waged systematic war against the FARC for over 50 years. Timoshenko commands an organization responsible for thousands of kidnappings, assassinations, and bombings. Yet, here they sit, preparing to embrace as television cameras broadcast their handshake to the world. The document they're about to sign represents 4 years of painstaking negotiations in Cuban conference rooms, where Colombian government negotiators and guerrilla commanders hammered out agreements on everything from rural development to transitional justice to the reintegration of former combatants into civilian society. This is the end of the war, Santos will tell the assembled diplomats and journalists. This is the beginning of peace. Timoshenko's response carries more caution. We lay down our weapons, but we do not lay down our convictions. The struggle for social justice continues, but now it continues through democratic means. What neither man says in this moment of carefully choreographed optimism is that peace agreements are easier to sign than to implement, that ending a war on paper is simpler than ending it in practice, and that the forces that created Colombia's conflict, exclusion, inequality, weak state presence, normalized violence, remained largely unchanged. Within months, the peace agreement will be rejected by Colombian voters in a referendum so close it shocks the world. Within years, hundreds of former FARC combatants and social leaders will be murdered by groups that refuse to accept that the war is over. The cocaine trade will continue to flourish, now contested by criminal organizations that lack the FARC's political ideology but possess all of their capacity for violence. This is the paradox of Colombia's peace. A society exhausted by war but struggling to embrace the compromises that peace requires. A country that has learned to survive systematic violence but finds it difficult to imagine life without it. This is part 5 of the Colombian conflict story, The Long Road Ahead. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Over the past 4 episodes, we've traced the DNA of Colombia's conflict from its roots in 19th century civil wars through La Violencia, the rise of guerrilla movements, the dirty war period, and the cocaine-fueled violence that made Colombia synonymous with systematic brutality. We've seen how each phase of the conflict created conditions for the next, how violence became normalized as a problem-solving mechanism, and how a society learned to adapt to circumstances that should have been unendurable. Today, we finally explore Colombia's attempts to break these cycles, the peace processes, truth commissions, and civil society movements that have tried to transform a culture of war into a culture of peace. But this is not a story with a happy ending, at least not yet. This is a story about the extraordinary difficulty of healing from systematic trauma, about the gap between formal agreements and social transformation, and about why some conflicts prove more resistant to resolution than others. If there's one thing you should understand about Colombian peace efforts, it is this. They represent some of the most sophisticated attempts at conflict resolution in modern history, supported by international expertise and enormous financial resources. And yet, they continue to struggle against patterns of exclusion and violence that have been embedded in Colombian society for well over a century. Understanding why peace remains so elusive requires examining what Colombia has tried to do and what it has been unable or unwilling to change about itself. The story of Colombia's peace process begins not with the government initiatives or international mediation, but with the courage of ordinary Colombians who refused to accept that violence was inevitable. Throughout the darkest periods of the conflict, during La Violencia, the Dirty War, or the Cocaine Wars, communities, organizations, and individuals have always found ways to resist the logic of mutual destruction. Let me take you to a scene that captures this grassroots resistance. Picture a community meeting in the local church, where villagers have gathered to discuss something unprecedented, declaring their neutrality in Colombia's armed conflict. Around wooden benches sit farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, and the elderly. People who have lived through decades of violence, who have lost family members to guerrillas, paramilitaries, and state forces. They're tired of being caught between competing armies, tired of having their sons recruited by armed groups, tired of watching their community torn apart by conflicts that they didn't start and can't control. We are in the town of Mogotes, in the Santander province, in March of 1998. We are not with the guerrillas, declares Father Miguel Gomez, the village priest, whose voice carries both pastoral authority and personal grief. His own brother was killed by paramilitaries 3 years earlier. We are not with the paramilitaries. We are not with anyone who brings violence to our community. We are with life, with peace, with the possibility that our children might grow up without learning to fear the sound of helicopters. This declaration of neutrality, repeated in hundreds of communities across Colombia, represented a form of resistance that armed groups found difficult to counter. How do you fight people who refuse to fight? How do you control communities that organize around the radical proposition that violence is not inevitable? The peace communities movement that emerged from initiatives like Mogotes created spaces where different rules applied, where armed actors were forbidden to enter, where civilian authority was respected, where conflicts were resolved through dialogue rather than force. These communities operated as laboratories for peace within a country at war, demonstrating that alternatives to violence were possible even under the most difficult circumstances. But the peace communities also paid a terrible price for their resistance. Between 1997 and 2020, over 300 members of peace communities were murdered by armed groups that viewed neutrality as betrayal. Their courage illuminates both the possibility of peaceful resistance and the forces arrayed against it. Maria Elena Ramirez, a teacher in one of these communities, explained the logic in testimony to the truth commissions years later. They told us we had to choose sides, but we chose life instead. That made us dangerous to everyone who needed the war to continue. The formal peace process between the Colombian government and the FARC began in earnest in 2010, when President Juan Manuel Santos, ironically, a former defense minister who had overseen military operations against the guerrillas, made the strategic decision that Colombia's conflict could not be won through military means alone. This wasn't capitulation to terrorism, as Santos' critics charge. It was a recognition of a mathematical reality. After 50 years of armed conflict, the FARC remained militarily viable, while the human and economic cost of continued war had become unsustainable. Colombia was spending more on defense than on education and health combined. Entire regions remained effectively ungoverned. The country's international reputation was defined by violence rather than its considerable cultural and economic achievements. But Santos also understood something that previous governments had missed. The FARC wasn't just a criminal organization that could be defeated through superior firepower. It was a political movement, however distorted by decades of violence, that represented genuine grievances about exclusion, inequality, and rural abandonment. Ending the war required addressing the symptoms of conflict and its underlying causes. The negotiations that began in Havana in 2012 were unlike any peace process in Latin American history. Instead of simple ceasefires or prisoner exchanges, the talks addressed 6 fundamental issues: rural development, political participation for former combatants, drug trafficking, victims' rights, transitional justice, and the verification mechanisms. I'll take you inside these negotiations to understand their unprecedented scope. We are back in Havana, Cuba, in 2012. Picture a scene that played out repeatedly in Cuban conference rooms. Colombian government negotiators, many with advanced degrees from American and European universities, sitting across from FARC commanders who had spent decades in jungle camps, trying to bridge political differences and entirely different life experiences. On the one side, career diplomats and technocrats who understood international law, economic development theory, and democratic institutions. On the other side, revolutionary leaders who had learned governance through armed struggle, who had never participated in electoral politics, who viewed the Colombian state as a historical enemy rather than a potential partner. The challenges were immense. How do you reintegrate 7,000 armed combatants who have known nothing but war into a society that fears and distrusts them? How do you provide justice for victims without destroying the incentives for former perpetrators to participate in peace? How do you transform territories controlled by illegal armed groups into spaces governed by legitimate institutions? The solutions developed in Havana were remarkably innovative. The peace agreement created transitional justice mechanisms that balanced accountability with reconciliation, offering reduced sentences to those who confessed their crimes and made reparations to victims. It established special development programs for FARC territories, recognizing that sustainable peace required alternatives to illegal economies and disarmament alone. It guaranteed political participation for former guerrillas, creating spaces for revolutionary ideology to compete with electoral rather than military arenas. The agreement's most radical innovation was its victim-centered approach. For the first time in Colombian history, those who had suffered from the conflict were placed at the center of the peace-building efforts. Victims' organizations participated directly in negotiations, ensuring that their voices shaped the final agreement. Luz Marina Bernal, whose husband and 2 sons were killed in a FARC attack in 2002, sat across from guerrilla commanders in Havana and told them directly, "I need to understand why you took everything from me. And you need to hear what your war actually cost, not in abstractions about political objectives, but in the specific details of destroyed lives." That conversation, multiplied across hundreds of similar encounters, presented something unprecedented in Colombian history. Perpetrators forced to confront the human consequences of their violence. Victims given space to demand acknowledgement rather than simply revenge. We are in Bogota on October 2nd of 2016. It is 8:30 p.m. Colombians gather around television sets and radios to hear the results of the referendum on the peace agreement. The polls had suggested a comfortable victory for the Yes campaign, supported by President Santos, the international community, and most important major newspapers. The No campaign, led by former President Álvaro Uribe, had argued that the agreement was too lenient on the FARC, that it rewarded terrorism rather than punishing it. As the results are announced, a stunned silence falls across the country.
Hoy me dirijo al país como presidente de todos los colombianos, tanto de los que votaron por el
No has won the narrowest of margins, 50.2% to 49.8%, a difference of less than 54,000 votes out of the 13 million cast. The referendum results exposed the profound divisions that the peace process had papered over but not resolved. Urban, educated Colombians had largely supported the agreement, viewing it as the best opportunity to end the conflict that had devastated rural areas for generations. But rural Colombians, those most affected by the violence, had voted against it, expressing skepticism that the FARC would honor its commitment and fear the peace would bring new forms of violence. More fundamentally, the referendum revealed that Colombian society remained divided about the nature of the conflict itself. For many Colombians, particularly those who had never directly experienced the war, the FARC remained simply a terrorist organization that deserved punishment, not negotiation. The idea that guerrillas might have legitimate grievances, that the state bore some responsibility for the conflict's persistence, that victims deserve recognition and reparations. These concepts challenge deeply held beliefs about Colombian society and its history. The No victory created a constitutional crisis. The government had negotiated an agreement that the Colombian voters had rejected. The FARC had agreed to disarm based on commitments that apparently lacked popular support. International observers who had invested enormous political capital in Colombian peace found themselves witnessing its apparent collapse. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Instead of abandoning the peace process, Colombian society demonstrated remarkable resilience and creativity. Within weeks, new negotiations began, involving the government and the FARC, but also all other sectors of society. The revised agreement addressed many concerns raised by the No voters while preserving the core commitments that made peace possible. When Congress ratified the modified agreement in November of 2016, it marked the end of formal negotiations and the beginning of the much more difficult process of implementation. The initial agreement was technically sophisticated and morally ambitious, but it failed to convince enough Colombians that peace was worth the compromises it required. The gap between peace agreements and peaceful societies becomes starkly apparent when we examine what has happened in former FARC territories since 2016. These regions, primarily in southern and eastern Colombia, were governed by guerrilla authorities for decades, with minimal state presence and economies based largely on coca cultivation and other illegal activities. Let me paint you a picture of what peace looks like in practice. We're walking through a village in Caquetá department in 2019, 3 years after the peace agreement was signed. The FARC camp that once controlled this area has been replaced by a government office that staffed inconsistently and often lacks basic resources. The dirt roads promised in the peace agreement remained unpaved. The alternative development programs that were supposed to replace coca cultivation have been delayed by bureaucracy and underfunding. Most ominously, the vacuum left by FARC's departure has been filled by other armed groups rather than by legitimate state institutions. The ELN, criminal organizations, and FARC dissidents who rejected the peace process now compete for control of territory and illegal economies. For local communities, this means that violence continues, even though the formal war has ended. The statistics are sobering. Since the peace agreement was signed, over 300 former FARC combatants have been murdered, along with more than 600 social leaders who advocated for implementation of the accords. These killings follow the same patterns that were established during the Dirty War period. Consider the case of Dimar Torres, a former FARC commander attempting to establish a legal political party in the Putumayo department. In May of 2019, as he traveled to a meeting with community leaders about crop substitution programs, his car was ambushed by unknown gunmen. The attack followed weeks of death threats warning him to abandon his political activities. Torres survived, but the message was clear. The peace agreement might guarantee former guerrillas the right to political participation, but it couldn't guarantee their physical survival. The same social forces that had sustained conflict for decades, landowner resistance to reform, state weakness in peripheral regions, criminal control of illegal economies, remained largely intact. This pattern of violence against peace process participants reveals something crucial about the nature of the Colombian conflict. The war wasn't just about ideology or territory. It was about power structures that benefited from exclusion and inequality. Peace threatened those structures in ways that formal military victories never could, because peace required genuine social transformation rather than just the defeat of armed opponents. Ana Fabricia Córdoba, a community leader in Choco, who has received multiple death threats for her work on land restitution, explained the dynamic this way. The war created certain people, very rich and powerful. Peace threatens to redistribute that wealth and power, so they find new ways to continue the war, just without the FARC as an excuse. The most ambitious attempts to address these challenges has been Colombia's transitional justice system, which represents perhaps the most comprehensive effort at truth-telling and accountability in Latin American history. The Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition Commission, established as part of the peace agreement, spent 3 years investigating the causes, patterns, and impacts of Colombia's armed conflict. Their final report, published in 2022, runs over 800 pages and represents an unprecedented accounting of Colombian violence. But more than documented atrocities, the Commission attempted something more difficult, explaining how ordinary people became perpetrators, how communities adapted to systematic violence, and how Colombian society might heal from trauma that has been transmitted across generations. Let me take you inside one of the Commission's public hearings to understand its significance. We are in the village of Bojabá, in Choco, in April of 2021. We're sitting in a community center where families gather to share testimonies about one of the conflict's most notorious massacres. The 2002 FARC bombing of a church that killed 79 civilians, including 48 children. But these hearings were designed for more than documenting suffering. They were about creating spaces where different truths could be acknowledged simultaneously. FARC commanders explained their political motivations while accepting responsibility for civilian casualties. Military officers discussed their operational constraints while acknowledging failures to protect non-combatants. Paramilitary leaders revealed the business logic behind massacres while recognizing the humanity of their victims. The complexity of these encounters cannot be overstated. Imagine sitting across from someone who murdered your family members, listening to their explanation of why they believed it was necessary, trying to find some path between justice and reconciliation that allows society to move forward without forgetting the past. Leonard Palacios, who lost his daughter and 32 other family members in the Bojabá massacre, described this experience testifying before FARC commanders. I needed them to see her face, to know her name, to understand that when they threw that cylinder bomb, they didn't just destroy a building, they destroyed futures, families, a community's sense of safety, and I needed to hear them say that they understood that. The Truth Commission's final report concluded that Colombia's conflict was not inevitable, that it resulted from specific choices about exclusion, inequality, and the normalization of violence as a problem solving mechanism. More importantly, it argued that sustainable peace required transforming the social conditions that made such conflict possible. But truth telling, however comprehensive, cannot by itself transform deeply embedded patterns of social exclusion. The Commission's recommendations for rural development, political reform, and reparations to victims require the same kind of social commitment that has proven so elusive throughout Colombian history. Understanding why peace remains so fragile requires examining Colombia's ongoing challenges through historical continuity rather than revolutionary change. Despite the peace agreements, transitional justice mechanisms, and enormous international support, the fundamental dynamics that created the conflict remain largely unchanged. Land distribution was central to guerrilla grievances and peace negotiations. The agreement promised comprehensive rural reform, including land redistribution and support for small farmers. Yet, 5 years later, 1% of landowners still control over 80% of productive land. The agreement guaranteed former FARC members congressional representation and created opportunities for opposition. But Colombia's democracy continues to be characterized by elite control and exclusion of popular sectors. Most fundamentally, the Colombian state remains absent in vast regions of the country, the same regions where violence first emerged in the 1940s and 1950s. Despite decades of conflict and multiple peace processes, the state has never established legitimate authority in territories comprising nearly half of the country. Here's what that looks like in practice. We're traveling through the Chocó department in 2023, one of Colombia's poorest and most neglected regions. Despite enormous mineral wealth and strategic importance, Chocó lacks basic infrastructure, educational opportunities, and economic alternatives to illegal activities. Young people face the same choices their grandparents faced during La Violencia: join armed groups, migrate to urban slums, or accept lives of grinding poverty and exclusion. The persistence of these conditions help explain why new forms of violence continue to emerge, even as old conflicts are formally resolved. Criminal organizations recruit from the same communities that once provided guerrilla fighters. Illegal armed groups control territory using the same methods that paramilitaries and guerrillas employed for decades. Violence remains normalized as a mechanism for resolving disputes and controlling populations. This doesn't mean peace efforts have failed entirely. Colombia today is significantly less violent than during the 1990s and early 2000s. Hundreds of thousands have returned to communities they fled. A generation of young Colombians has grown up with greater opportunities than their parents enjoyed. But sustainable peace requires transforming the societies that produce the conflict, far more difficult than negotiating ceasefires or disarming combatants. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Colombia's peace process is that ending war is easier than building peace, that formal agreements are simpler than social transformation, and that some conflicts are more resistant to resolution than others precisely because they reflect fundamental questions about how societies organize themselves. Colombia's conflict didn't emerge from ethnic hatred or religious fundamentalism. It emerged from questions about inclusion and exclusion, about who gets to participate in political and economic life, about what role the state should play in addressing inequality. These are questions that democracies worldwide continue to struggle with. Colombia's experience suggests that conflicts rooted in structural issues are particularly difficult to resolve because they require fundamentally transforming social relationships. Dominant groups must accept limitations on their power. States must extend genuine authority to historically neglected regions. Societies must embrace inclusion that challenges established hierarchies. This helps explain why Colombian peace remains incomplete and why new forms of violence emerge even as old conflicts are resolved. But it also offers valuable lessons for other societies grappling with similar challenges. The most important lesson may be that sustainable peace requires genuine social commitment to addressing the conditions that make violence seem rational to significant portions of the population. This kind of commitment cannot be imposed from the outside or negotiated in conference rooms. It must emerge from within societies themselves, from recognition that everyone benefits when conflicts are resolved through democratic rather than violent means. As we conclude our journey through Colombia's conflict, it's worth reflecting on what this extraordinary and tragic story reveals about the nature of violence, the possibilities for peace, and the resilience of human societies under impossible circumstances. In our current era of rising authoritarianism and political violence, Colombia's experience offers both warning and inspiration. The warning: democratic institutions can collapse when they serve only the powerful. Violence can become normalized as a political tool. Social trust, once destroyed, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. The inspiration: if Colombia, after a century and a half of normalized violence, can develop sophisticated mechanisms for transitional justice and conflict resolution, then transformation remains possible, even under the most difficult of circumstances. Perhaps that is Colombia's most important lesson. The time to address the weakness of our foundations, to talk to each other as fellow citizens rather than enemies, is now, before systemic violence makes reconciliation exponentially more difficult. Next time, on Double Helix, we turn to another nation torn apart by civil war, but one whose conflict has been mythologized and misunderstood in ways that continue to shape American identity to this day. We'll explore how the United States, barely 8 decades old at the time, nearly destroyed itself over the question of slavery, union, and the meaning of democracy itself. Through the stories of ordinary Americans caught in extraordinary circumstances, we'll examine how a republic founded on ideals of equality could simultaneously embrace human bondage, how economic interests became moral crusades, and how a war that began over constitutional questions became a struggle for the soul of the American civilization. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you soon.